I'm going to talk about religion and ecology, sort of some of the foundations of the field, how I got interested in it. And I'm not actually going to talk that much about my research in Bhutan, although we can talk about it in the discussion, which I'll try to leave about half the class period for. But I realized last night that my talk had not included the Buddhist perspective. So if you want to talk about that, we can talk about it in the second half. I'm just going to do the ecology from a local and global perspective part of the title. So I want to take you back in US history about 75 years. It was right during the Great Depression. It was during the Dust Bowl years. I mention this because it seems a little bit similar to our current moment, a time of lowered enthusiasm, perhaps lowered confidence in the country. People had lost homes and savings and jobs in the Depression. People had watched the very important natural resource, their soil, dry up and blow away. Why did that happen? Extensive farming, tilling deeply into the earth, disturbing the roots of the native grasses that had held the soil in place. The native grasses throughout the middle of the country were pretty much gone as agriculture expanded across the country. And when a serious drought came, there was nothing to hold the soil in place. The soil dried up. Windstorms came, blew away the soil. Great, great dust clouds that reduced visibility to less than a meter sometimes. You've probably heard about the Dust Bowl years, right? So the reason I was thinking about this is that we have recently also watched a major important natural resource on which our economy is dependent disperse into the surroundings. In this case, it was oil in the Gulf, but we watched sort of helplessly as it just dispersed and dispersed and dispersed, no longer contained in a way that was useful or capturable, no longer contained in a way that we could draw value out of it. So I feel like we're revisiting this time maybe of loss of resources and lowered expectation. And something really optimistic happened at that time. So perhaps it can happen at this time as well. And what that was, many things happened, but what I want to tell you about is a fellow named Aldo Leopold. You might have heard of him. Anyone heard of him? Yeah, okay, great. He was a professor of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He was trained as a forester at Yale, spent some time working as a forester in New Mexico and Arizona, and then became a professor. And he and his family decided they needed a weekend retreat, maybe even a hunting retreat. They looked around the area around Madison in the 1930s, and they found this worn out, dried up old farm that someone had abandoned because they couldn't farm anymore. The major drought had come, major heat wave had just desiccated the land. So the Leopolds bought this land for $8 an acre, which people thought was crazy because it was a worthless piece of land. And the dominant American cultural narrative says, go out and get something richer, look for something better. There's always new land to explore, something new to uncover. But the Leopolds, for some reason, they didn't do that. They just bought this worn out piece of land, and on it there was a chicken coop. And they decided that that would be their weekend house. They renovated the chicken coop into a habitable place. Some reports say there was about a foot of chicken manure on the ground, but somehow they cleaned it up, made it more habitable, made a little addition because they had 5 kids, so they needed some space. And that was their weekend retreat. And they started a very interesting experiment on that piece of land. They started planting native plants, pine trees, other trees, and experimenting with how to restore some liveliness into that land, what they could do to bring back the flourishing of that land. Bit by bit, over the course of dozens of years, they restored some of the prairie around the shack. That's what they called their little chicken coop. They called it the shack. So some people have summer mansions. They had the shack. They planted eventually 40,000 trees all around their land and eventually restored this land. So this was an early example of restoration ecology, which in the 1980s became an actual field of science and practice, but it took that long for this so it took about 50 years for this very prescient idea to catch on as a practice and as a field of study. And I mentioned Leopold because he wrote some things back in the 30s that are really relevant today. And I don't think they have received the attention they believe. And in fact, they're very congruent with what we talk about in PCC. So that's why I wanted to bring them up to you. So Leopold is here on his farm outside of Madison in a very flat, unassuming landscape. It's not dramatic like Yosemite. There's no soaring cliffs or mountains. It's just rolling hills or flattish hills. But he could perceive by paying close attention to that land and to his thoughts that worldviews really shaped the way people interacted with the land. And he wrote in a Sand County Almanac, which is perhaps his most famous book, an innumerable host of actions and attitudes comprising perhaps the bulk of all land relations is determined by the land user's tastes and predilections rather than by his purse. The bulk of all land relations hinges on investments of time, forethought, skill, and faith rather than on investments of cash. As a land user thinketh, so is he. So the importance of worldviews. This was written by, as I said, a wildlife manager, not a philosopher. And this was long before the first Earth Day, long before the environmental movement got started. And here's Leopold saying, hey, you know, we've got to think about how people think if we want to deal with the land. He also thought that part of the reason that people hadn't embraced, so he's responding to the Dust Bowl and this devastation on the land. And he thought part of the reason that people hadn't adopted a more thoughtful approach to the land was because religion and philosophy hadn't heard of conservation, as it was called at that time. He said, no important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that religion and philosophy have not yet heard of it. In our attempt to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial. So he wrote that, well, his book was published in 1949. I don't know exactly when he wrote it, but sometime before that. So more than 50 years ago. And yet, religion and ecology as a field probably got going in the last 20 years, like since the 1990s. So I want you to see how ahead of his time Leopold was. And so I gave you the Lynn White article to read, in which Lynn White, the UCLA historian, suggested that Christianity was very detrimental to the natural environment. And then, well, I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but people have definitely debated that thesis extensively. Rather than suggesting that Americans should abandon Christianity and that it was very dangerous to the natural world, Leopold embraced the roots, the Western roots of his heritage. And he saw the extension of ethics to the natural environment as what he called a process of ecological evolution. Again, very much in harmony with what we talk about in PCC. He built his argument for moral concern about the land on an extension of ethics that began from the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai and extended to the Golden Rule. And then he saw an expanding circle of concern that would extend outward to animals, plants, and ultimately the land itself. So rather than turning away from his Western heritage, he wanted to embrace it and see how that could be extended into an environmental ethic. And I think this relates with the very countercultural thing that the Leopold family did of staying on the land rather than seeking out a new land. So rather than saying, oh, the Western ethic is no good, we have to find a new one, he said, let's look at the history of the Western ethic and how we can extend it to embrace the natural environment. Just like they said, rather than running off to the West Coast, we're going to just stay here in Wisconsin and try to restore some of this land. So in the land ethic, the Sand County Almanac contains many chapters of reflection on his experiences and his family's sense of place right there in Wisconsin. It's called an almanac because part of it just goes month by month, his observations of the land and the creatures on it and his experiences on it. He also develops his land ethic in this book, kind of summarizing what he has come to believe based on his close observation of the land. And he writes, all ethics so far rest on a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. His instincts prompt him to compete for his place in that community, but his ethics prompt him also to cooperate, perhaps in order that there may be a place to compete for. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. This sounds simple. Do we not already sing of our love for and obligation to the land of the free and the home of the brave? Yes, but just what and whom do we love? Certainly not the soil, which we are sending helter-skelter downriver. Certainly not the waters, which we assume have no function except to turn turbines, float barges, and carry off sewage. Certainly not the plants, of which we exterminate whole communities without batting an eye. Certainly not the animals, of which we have already extirpated many of the largest and most beautiful species. Now, this is in the 1930s. Whoa. A land ethic, of course, cannot prevent the alteration, management, and use of these resources, but it does affirm their right to continued existence, and at least in spots, their continued existence in a natural state. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies a respect for his fellow members and also a respect for the community as such.